Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
Imagine sitting around the Thanksgiving table with the turkey steaming in the center of it all, surrounded by the familiar scents of sage and butter that usually signal warmth and gratitude, only to have your own father look you straight in the eye and declare without a shred of remorse that he is auctioning off everything you grew up fighting to protect, while your siblings, those opportunistic siblings who have always prioritized their own comfort over family unity, start clapping and cheering. Like it is the most liberating news imaginable, leaving you to wonder in that frozen moment if blood ties truly hold more value than the cold precision of a $1 billion contract that could rewrite your entire legacy in an instant. I never imagined that a simple plate of mashed potatoes swirled with gravy and dotted with tart cranberry sauce could carry the bitter aftertaste of outright betrayal, yet there I found myself on that crisp November afternoon, fork poised midway to my mouth as I stared across the polished oak dining table at my father, Robert Hargrove, whose weathered hands, marked by decades of gripping plows and signing payrolls for the sprawling agribusiness that bore our name, trembled just slightly while he cleared his throat to deliver the announcement that would fracture our already tenuous family bonds beyond repair. The old farmhouse nestled in the rolling hills of rural Iowa, with its sagging front porch and vast fields of harvested corn stretching out like a golden sea frozen in time under the slate-gray sky, had hosted countless holidays filled with underlying tensions from old arguments over crop rotations and inheritance whispers. But this particular gathering carried an electric undercurrent from the very second I maneuvered my rented SUV up the gravel driveway, the tires crunching over loose stones, in a rhythm that echoed the unease building in my chest after months of hearing vague rumors through the grapevine of extended relatives who still clung to the illusion of our unbreakable Midwestern solidarity. My siblings had arrived ahead of me as always, Jack with his perpetual air of self-importance accentuated by that ill-fitting flannel shirt he insists on wearing to assert his role as the hands-on farm manager, and Linda, impeccably dressed in her urban chic from her high-powered marketing job in Chicago, already positioning herself as the voice of reason even though her visits were more about scouting investment opportunities than genuine reconnection. Dad, at 72 years old and looking every bit the stoic patriarch with his salt and pepper hair thinning at the temples and eyes that had seen too many harsh winters and market crashes, seemed diminished in his chair at the head of the table. Yet there was an unyielding determination in his posture that suggested he had finally reached the end of his patience with the endless cycle of family disputes that had simmered since Mom passed a decade ago, leaving him to navigate the business alone amid rising costs and regulatory pressures that threatened to swallow the empire he had built from a single tractor and a dream of self-sufficiency. We had scarcely finished the grace, recited in Dad's gravelly voice with the same rote familiarity as every year, when he shoved back his chair with a screech that cut through the clink of silverware, drawing all eyes to him as he announced in that no-nonsense drawl honed from years of negotiating with suppliers and bankers that after 40 grueling years of pouring his life into Hargrove agribusiness, he was selling the whole operation outright, including the thousands of acres of fertile soil that had weathered droughts, floods, and the relentless march of corporate consolidation in the heartland. A decision that would finally free him from the burdens that had aged him prematurely and allow him to chase the retirement fantasies of warmer climates and worry-free days. The room hung in suspended silence for a heartbeat, the kind that amplifies every rustle of napkins and shift in seating, before Jack erupted into a triumphant whoop that shook the crystal water glasses, slapping the table with enough force to send ripples through the gravy boat and drawing a calculated chuckle from Linda, who immediately chimed in with her polished endorsement about how it was high time they capitalized on Dad's legacy before the next recession or environmental mandate eroded its value, her words laced with a subtle implication that sticking with tradition was for fools clinging to outdated notions of family duty. I remained seated, the heat of indignation rising like bile in my throat, not from sheer shock, because the whispers of financial strain had reached even my distant perch in Seattle, where I had carved out a life in tech investments far removed from the daily grind of soil and seed, but from the deliberate sting of exclusion when Dad turned his gaze directly to me, the daughter who had dared to venture beyond the farm's fences after a contentious divorce and a string of rejected proposals to modernize operations with sustainable tech, and added with unflinching clarity that none of his children would receive so much as a single dime from the proceeds, that the funds would flow toward charities of his choosing or perhaps just vanish into the ether of his personal whims, as if my contributions during those long summer breaks hauling hay bales and crunching balance sheets in the dim office light counted for nothing in his final accounting. Jack and Linda exchanged triumphant glances, their cheers evolving into smirks that pierced like barbs, reveling in the validation of their loyalty while painting me as the perennial outsider who had abandoned the fold for selfish pursuits. But I swallowed the retort bubbling up, forcing a smile that masked the calculated fury igniting within me, and leaned forward with deliberate poise to inquire in a tone as steady as the ancient oak's lining. The property, who precisely was the buyer willing to part with such an enormous sum to claim this slice of American heartland that held so many layers of our shared history? Dad hesitated for the briefest moment, his fork hovering over a slice of turkey as if weighing the revelation, before stating matter-of-factly that Arctic Line Investments, a firm based out of Denver with a reputation for snapping up undervalued assets in the AG sector, had tabled a straightforward offer of $55 million, clean and unconditional, sufficient to fund his escape to Florida sunsets and golf courses far from the calluses and conflicts that defined his existence. The siblings' enthusiasm surged anew, glasses clinking in toasts to fresh starts and financial freedom, but I lifted mine even higher, my thoughts whirling through the intricate web of arrangements I had woven in secrecy over the past several years, and delivered the line that hung in the air like a thunderclap, saying with a subtle wink that concealed the depth of my orchestration, "Congratulations, Dad, because in that very transaction, you have just handed over the reins to me without even realizing the full extent of the power shift unfolding right under your noses." The table descended into stunned quiet, utensils dropping with metallic clatters against plates as Jack's expression contorted into bewildered outrage and Linda's eyes sharpened with the first flickers of suspicion, piecing together fragments of my seemingly innocuous return to the fold, and in that charged instant, I relished the initial flavor of retribution through a deceptively light toast to the prosperous horizons awaiting the company, leaving them to grapple with the uncertainty of whether my words stemmed from delusion or a hidden arsenal of influence, especially as the apple pie was sliced and distributed amid faltering small talk, because deep down, I understood that the true banquet of revelations and reckonings was only just commencing, with undercurrents of long-buried secrets poised to surface and reshape everything before the last crumbs were cleared away. The pumpkin pie, still warm from the oven with its spiced crust flaking at the edges and filling the air with that nostalgic blend of cinnamon and cloves that typically evokes fond memories of simpler times around the family hearth, had scarcely been divided among us when the atmosphere in the living room shifted from tentative truce to outright ambush, my siblings launching into a barrage of questions and jabs that peeled back the layers of their resentment toward me as if I were some interloper crashing their well-deserved windfall rather than the sister who had shared in the same childhood chores and heartaches that forged this dysfunctional dynasty. We had all migrated from the dining table to the worn leather sofas clustered around the stone fireplace, where flames licked at logs Dad had chopped himself earlier that week, casting flickering shadows across the walls adorned with faded photographs of harvest seasons long past and the faces of ancestors who had toiled under the same relentless sun without the luxury of multi-million-dollar exits, the crackle of the fire underscoring the growing discord as Jack positioned himself on the ottoman directly in front of me, his broad shoulders hunched forward in that aggressive stance he adopts whenever he senses an opportunity to assert dominance, his breath carrying the sharp tang of the bourbon-spiked apple cider he had been nursing since the announcement to celebrate what he viewed as his vindication after years of loyal service to the farm's unforgiving demands. Linda, never one to miss a chance to play the intellectual superior with her tablet propped on her knee like a shield, leaned in from the adjacent armchair, her manicured fingers tapping the screen as she pulled up preliminary articles on Arctic Line investments that painted the firm as a savvy player in the agricultural consolidation wave sweeping the Midwest. Her voice modulating into that condescending lilt she reserves for boardroom presentations or family interventions, probing why on earth I would utter such an absurd claim about owning the buyer when my track record screamed of a nomadic consultant life in Seattle, bouncing between underfunded startups and divorce settlements that left me far from the league of high-stakes acquisitions. Dad observed from his recliner across the room, his pipe clenched between his teeth unlit as if the weight of the evening's revelations had dulled even his old habits, his silence a brooding presence that amplified the siblings' onslaught. With Jack recounting in vivid detail how I had always been the wild card, the one pushing for experimental solar installations on the barns during my sporadic visits, only to vanish back to the city when the initial loans ballooned into crises that forced him to cover the shortfalls from his own pocket, while Linda piled on with sympathetic sighs about how my post-divorce reinventions as a tech advisor must have clouded my judgment, suggesting gently but pointedly that perhaps I needed a dose of reality to accept the sale as the merciful end to a chapter none of U.S. could sustain anymore amid skyrocketing insurance premiums and labor shortages that had turned farming into a relic of bygone eras. I navigated the interrogation with measured deflections, sinking deeper into the cushions and stirring my own mug of decaf to buy moments of composure, sharing selective anecdotes from my recent portfolio in green energy ventures that hinted at broader connections without exposing the intricate network of shell companies and venture capital infusions I had funneled into Arctic Line over the preceding half-decade, all fueled by the cumulative sting of holidays where they had dismissed my visions as impractical dreams unfit for the gritty realities of soil-stained hands and volatile commodity prices. My responses laced with a dry humor that masked the strategic calculations churning beneath, like quipping that $55 million might indeed purchase enough family counseling sessions to unpack the baggage we all carried from Mom's illness and the unequal shares of emotional labor that followed. As the conversation looped into increasingly personal territory, with Jack's volume rising to drown out the wind howling against the windows and Linda cross-referencing my past employers against the buyer's board listings, I excused myself under the pretense of needing fresh air, stepping out onto the wraparound porch where the November chill wrapped around me like an old coat, the stars piercing the clear sky above the silhouette of distant silos that had stood sentinel through generations of Hargrove ambition and adversity, and there, leaning against the railing with my phone shielded in my palm, I placed a discreet call to my assistant in Seattle, instructing her to anonymously forward a tip to a trusted reporter at the Des Moines Register about subtle environmental compliance gaps in Arctic Line's recent acquisitions. Nothing fabricated or explosive, but calibrated precisely to generate a ripple of local media interest that would have Jack monitoring headlines by dawn and questioning the deal's pristine facade. It served as my initial stroke of retribution, a clever undercurrent designed to erode their smug certainty without leaving traces back to me, allowing me to re-enter the warmth of the living room with a refreshed demeanor that only heightened their frustration as they continued their verbal siege, oblivious to the threads I was pulling from afar to weave doubt into their triumphant narrative. But the evening's tension crested when Linda, after a prolonged session of scrolling through professional networks on her device, suddenly bolted upright from her seat, her face draining of color under the lamplight as she thrust the screen toward the group, stammering about an overlooked LinkedIn endorsement from 5 years prior that linked a minor executive at Arctic Line to a boutique firm I had consulted for during my early post-divorce scramble, her wide-eyed realization hanging in the charged air like the prelude to a storm, forcing me to mask my inward thrill behind a casual shrug while the implications of that tenuous connection lingered unresolved, promising revelations that could upend the fragile equilibrium before the night fully surrendered to sleep. The morning following Thanksgiving arrived with a pallid light filtering through the frost-etched panes of the farmhouse kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the scarred wooden counters where the greasy remnants of yesterday's feast lingered in congealed pools amid scattered crumbs and crumpled napkins. A visual echo of the deal's advancing momentum that now loomed over us like an inevitable harvest ready to be reaped regardless of the human costs involved in uprooting decades of shared labor and unspoken grievances. I had risen early, the chill seeping through the thin walls prompting me to brew a pot of strong black coffee that filled the space with its robust aroma. A small ritual of normalcy before the influx of legal proceedings turned the cozy domesticity into a makeshift war room buzzing with the low hum of printers and the rustle of confidential folders, as old Mr. Wilkins, the family attorney whose spectacles perpetually slid down his nose and whose tweed jackets carried the faint must of dusty law tomes from his cluttered office in town, pulled up in his sensible sedan right on cue. Briefcase in hand and a stack of preliminary contracts spilling over with clauses that outlined the path to closing in just 2 weeks if the stars aligned against the usual bureaucratic snarls. Jack hovered near the doorway like a sentinel, his work boots tracking mud from the yard where he had been pacing phone calls to his crew about interim operations. Nodding vigorously as Wilkins laid out the framework for Arctic Line Investments to assume control seamlessly, promising to retain the core workforce that had become like extended kin through years of overtime during planting and picking seasons. While Linda positioned herself at the breakfast table with her laptop open, her fingers flying across the keys to dissect the fine print on tax shelters and restrictive covenants that could bind the family's hands long after the ink dried, her questions probing like scalpels into potential loopholes that might allow for personal carve-outs amid the corporate takeover. Dad, seated at the head with his reading glasses perched low, affixed his signature to the initial disclosure forms with a decisive stroke that belied the subtle tremor in his hand. A gesture that stirred a complex brew of resentment and reluctant admiration in me for the man who had bootstrapped this operation from a modest plot into a regional powerhouse, only to now orchestrate its sale in a way that sidelined his own offspring, including the daughter whose innovative pitches for crop diversification he had repeatedly shot down as too risky for the conservative banking ties that kept the lights on through lean years. I inserted myself into the discussion from the nook, mug in hand, and feigning the role of the conciliatory outsider returned to bridge gaps, interjecting observations about the whispers of groundwater contamination plaguing adjacent properties that could invite regulatory scrutiny and unsettle even the most ironclad buyers, my words chosen to plant seeds of caution without overt alarm, particularly as Jack's phone buzzed with notifications from the local news outlet where my anonymous tip had blossomed into a brief segment questioning Arctic Line's environmental track record in similar deals, his face reddening with frustration that he immediately attributed to my loose-lipped influence from the dinner table the night before. The proceedings gained traction over a hasty lunch of reheated leftovers slapped between slices of bread, the air thickening with discord when Wilkins unearthed a complication buried in the title reports, revealing an unresolved easement conflict with the neighboring cooperative over shared irrigation rights that dated back to a boundary survey from the 80s. A minor technicality on paper, but one potent enough to stall appraisals and invite countersuits if not ironed out swiftly, prompting Jack to whirl on me with accusations that my meddling had somehow amplified the issue through back-channel gossip among the co-op members he relied on for seasonal labor. Undeterred, I proposed involving an independent surveyor to validate the parcel valuations and expedite resolutions, all while my thoughts raced ahead to the leverage I held through discreet funding I had channeled to that very co-op via layered proxies years earlier. A strategic investment disguised as philanthropy to empower them against exploitative consolidators like the ones my family now courted, allowing me to subtly steer the dispute toward a favorable delay without collapsing the negotiations entirely. As the session stretched into the afternoon, with sandwiches devoured amid escalating debates over contingency fees and escape clauses, I slipped away to the sunroom under the guise of reviewing emails, placing a hushed call to my Seattle team to activate a decoy bidder through a fabricated entity posing as an East Coast hedge fund. Their offer calibrated just high enough to pressure Arctic Line into concessions on worker protections and land stewardship terms without derailing the core transaction, serving as my ingenious retaliation against the siblings' earlier jubilation by transforming their anticipated windfall into a labyrinth of inflated stakes and eroded certainties. Wilkins's expression soured mid-explanation when an alert chimed on his device about the phantom competitor entering the fray, muttering under his breath about the need for accelerated due diligence as Dad rubbed his temples in evident weariness. The room's energy fracturing further when Jack unearthed details of his own concealed financial entanglements, a mounting line of credit for equipment upgrades that the sales structure might not fully absolve, threatening to complicate his personal guarantees and force uncomfortable disclosures that could ripple through the entire agreement. The day waned into a haze of follow-up consultations and tentative handshakes over revised outlines, the family dynamics straining under the weight of revelations that exposed not just business vulnerabilities, but the personal frailties we had all buried beneath layers of pride and pretense, culminating in Dad drawing me into the quiet of his study as twilight deepened outside, the walls lined with ledgers from prosperous eras now gathering dust, where he held up a yellowed photograph of us children perched atop the old John Deere tractor during a sun-drenched childhood outing some 30 years prior, his voice laced with a rare vulnerability as he confronted me directly about whether the sudden influx of hurdles and rival interests bore any mark of my orchestration. The intensity of his gaze piercing through my composed exterior just as the door burst open with Jack storming in, brandishing a sheaf of printed emails that tenuously connected my name to the co-op's legal counsel through a forgotten conference listing. His furious demand for explanations reverberating like the first rumble of thunder in the gathering dusk. By the time the evening shadows lengthened across the farmhouse on that tense Saturday, transforming the familiar rooms into enclaves of suspicion where every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo the fractures widening within our family circle, the atmosphere had evolved from simmering discord into a full-blown siege of revelations and recriminations that peeled away the veneers of civility we had all maintained through years of obligatory gatherings, masking deeper rifts over money, loyalty, and the unyielding grip of legacy on our individual paths. Dad had withdrawn to his den after the confrontation in the study, the door clicking shut behind him like a verdict as he pored over the latest revisions to the contract spurred by the phantom bidder's pressure. His absence leaving the rest of us to navigate the fallout from Jack's dramatic entrance with those damning printouts, the email's tenuous threads linking my name to the co-op's counsel through a long-forgotten industry panel that now fueled his accusations of sabotage aimed at derailing the sale for some petty grudge against his managerial throne. Linda, seizing the momentary chaos, had commandeered the dining table as her command center, her laptop screen glowing with tabs open to regulatory filings and competitor analyses on Arctic Line, her fingers drumming an impatient rhythm as she cross-examined me about the coincidences piling up like drifts of Iowa snow, her tone blending feigned sisterly worry with the sharp edge of someone who had always viewed my independence as a threat to the hierarchical order she thrived in back in Chicago's cutthroat marketing world. Jack, still red-faced and gesturing wildly with the papers clutched in his fist, alternated between pacing the length of the room and jabbing a finger toward me, recounting how the easement snag and media whispers had already cost him sleep and credibility with the farmhands who depended on the deal's stability for their winter bonuses, his voice booming over the sizzle of pot roast bubbling on the stove where Linda had thrown together a semblance of dinner to keep up appearances amid the unraveling. I held my ground in the armchair by the window, the cool glass pressing against my back as I deflected with a mix of wry observations and partial truths, admitting only to past consulting gigs that brushed against agricultural nonprofits without delving into the deliberate architecture of my Arctic Line facade, my responses infused with that light humor that disarmed without surrendering ground. Like joking that if I were truly the puppet master, I'd have scripted a more dramatic entrance than a dusty conference listing from half a decade ago. The pot roast, aromatic with rosemary and caramelized onions that usually signaled comfort in times of strife, became the ironic backdrop for our strained meal. Plates passed around the table in awkward silence, broken only by the clink of cutlery and occasional barbs about how the farm's future hung on threads thinner than Dad's patience after Mom's long illness had left him bearing the emotional load alone while we scattered to our separate ambitions. Midway through the meal, as tensions coiled tighter with each bite, the gravel driveway crunched under tires that announced an uninvited arrival, and there stood Tom, my ex-husband, silhouetted in the doorway with his weathered pickup idling behind him. His presence a blast from the past reeking of opportunism and the faint scent of cheap aftershave that had once seemed charming, but now grated like sand in the gears of progress. Tom, with his perpetual stubble and eyes that darted calculatingly around the room, claimed the drive from his latest real estate flop in Omaha had been spurred by grapevine chatter about the sale. But his real agenda unfurled over after-dinner drinks in the garage, where he cornered Jack with tales of irregularities in the title deeds unearthed from his flipping days, dangling leverage like a carrot on a stick in exchange for a slice of the proceeds to settle his lingering debts, his smooth patter painting Arctic Line as potentially shady enough to warrant a deeper audit that could delay closing and inflate his consulting fee. Linda pulled me into the hallway's shadows during this interlude, her whisper urgent as she relayed Tom's whispers about insider ties that mirrored my own veiled connections, urging me to disclose any hidden hands before the mess implicated the whole family in ethical quagmires that could tarnish reputations built on generations of honest toil. Her plea laced with the dilemma of choosing between blood and self-preservation in a deal teetering on the brink. As the night deepened and the group reconvened around the fireplace for a purported strategy huddle, Jack attempted to rally support for a direct showdown with Arctic Line's intermediaries, only for Tom to interject with embellished credentials from his checkered past, prompting me to counter seamlessly by circulating a casually compiled dossier on his failed ventures, gleaned from public records and shared with a feigned air of concern, that exposed a pattern of bounce checks and abandoned projects, turning the meeting into a humorous sideshow of Tom's flustered backpedaling as the siblings chuckled uneasily at his expense. My indirect humiliation a satisfying jab that neutralized his threat without descending into outright confrontation and left him muttering excuses as he retreated to his truck under the cover of darkness. Yet the victories felt hollow amid the growing uncertainty, with Dad emerging briefly to announce accelerated timelines pushing closing to the morrow, his fatigue evident in the lines etching his face deeper. And just as a fragile calm settled with the embers dying in the grate, my phone vibrated in my pocket with an urgent message from my assistant detailing a catastrophic leak hitting financial wires that morning, an erroneous report of funding discrepancies at Arctic Line traced back through digital breadcrumbs to a Seattle IP address perilously close to my own operations, the implications crashing over me like a rogue wave as Linda's eyes locked onto the glow of my screen, her question about the closing's survival hanging unanswered in the thickening air. Sunday morning unfolded with a deceptive serenity that belied the undercurrents of exhaustion and apprehension swirling through the farmhouse. Sunlight piercing the lace curtains to illuminate the kitchen where the percolator gurgled its final notes into mugs that steamed with the promise of normalcy amid the chaos of a closing deadline now bearing down like the final deadline on a harvest that could make or break a season's fortunes, everyone moving through the motions of breakfast with the precision of actors in a play whose script had veered into uncharted territory overnight. Dad had surfaced from his den at first light, his eyes shadowed by the weight of sleepless hours spent negotiating extensions with Wilkins over the phone, the attorney's voice crackling through the speaker about how the leaked funding scandal, traced to anonymous sources but rippling through financial news wires with mentions of irregular capital flows at Arctic Line, had shaved potential value from the deal and invited last-minute audits that could unravel the entire structure if not contained swiftly. His updates delivered in clipped tones that masked the personal toll of watching his life's work teeter on the edge of a precipice, forged from family suspicions and external vultures circling for scraps. Jack slumped at the table nursing his coffee black and bitter, his earlier bluster deflated into mutters about pulling the plug to spite whatever invisible forces had turned their golden ticket into a ticking bomb. His personal debts now exposed in the revised financial disclosures as a liability that Wilkins had flagged for separate resolution, forcing him to confront the fragility of his self-image as the steadfast heir who had sacrificed city dreams for the soil only to find himself entangled in loans he could no longer service without the sale's proceeds. Linda, ever the adapter, paced with her tablet in hand reviewing counteroffers from the decoy bidder that had mysteriously evaporated, her composure fraying at the edges as she fielded calls from her Chicago contacts probing for insider scoops that could boost her career if spun right, yet her glances toward me carried a mix of accusation and reluctant alliance, as if weighing whether to drag me into the fray or leverage my supposed connections to salvage the remnants of Dad's legacy before reporters amassed at the gate like locusts drawn to the scent of scandal. Tom had vanished into the ether after his ignominious exit the previous night, his voicemail taunts to Dad about my shadowy involvements dismissed as sour grapes from a man whose credibility lay in tatters, but the damage lingered in the air, thickening the atmosphere as Wilkins arrived precisely at 10 with his leather satchel bulging with the finalized documents, the virtual link to Arctic Line's representative set to activate at noon sharp for the electronic signatures that would transfer control of the thousands of acres encompassing cornfields, silos, and the very heartbeat of our Midwestern roots into unknown hands. I contributed to the subdued preparations by slicing fruit and toasting bread, my outward calm a deliberate veil over the adrenaline surging through me from the leak's unintended blowback, which my team had contained overnight through rapid redirects, but not before it cast a pall that made even Dad question the buyer's solvency, his hesitation evident as he scanned the addendums stipulating worker retentions and land use restrictions that I had embedded through proxies to ensure the farm's evolution rather than exploitation. The video conference flickered to life on Wilkins's laptop in the dining room, the Denver suits appearing crisp and professional against a backdrop of city skyline, their assurances about the funding hiccup ringing hollow yet persuasive enough to coax tentative approvals from the group, with Jack grumbling about contingencies and Linda noting clauses for audits, the room's tension coiling tighter as Dad's pen hovered over the physical copies for his final affirmation, his gaze seeking mine in a moment of raw vulnerability that pierced the armor I had built from years of exclusions and overlooked contributions. That was when I rose from my seat, the chair scraping softly against the floorboards, and laid bare the intricate truth in a voice steady with the vindication of long-planned retribution, confessing that Arctic Line stood as my creation, meticulously assembled from the embers of tech successes and the ashes of family dismissals. The $55 million offer not a distant corporate grab, but my orchestrated reclamation designed to infuse the operation with sustainable innovations like precision irrigation and carbon credit programs that would honor the land's endurance, while securing its future against the very consolidations that had eroded smaller farms across the heartland. Chaos erupted in waves, Jack surging forward with shouts of deceit that echoed off the walls, while Linda recoiled in stunned calculation, her mind already racing toward legal countersuits and fractured trusts, Dad's face a mosaic of betrayal mingled with a flicker of begrudging respect for the daughter he had underestimated. But I parried with the masterstroke of my design, unveiling pre-embedded legal maneuvers in the contract, irrevocable trusts and performance-based escrows that locked in protections for the employees Jack championed and the ecosystems Linda's urban conscience might one day appreciate, my clever culmination of revenge transforming their cheers of exclusion into a humbling realization that I had outmaneuvered them not through destruction, but through a vision they had scorned. The signatures proceeding under my veiled oversight as the reps, unwitting accomplices in the charade, confirmed the transfer with digital seals that bound the legacy to my stewardship. As the call ended and handshakes exchanged in the stunned hush that followed, with reporters dispersed, empty-handed and the family scattering to process the seismic shift, I wandered alone to the edge of the fields where the stubble whispered under the afternoon breeze, The vast expanse stretching toward the horizon, a canvas of possibilities laced with the dilemmas of my choices. Had I preserved the heart of Hargrove agribusiness, or merely cloaked it in my ambition? Exacting justice at the cost of bridges burned irreparably, and in the quiet aftermath, could threads of reconciliation weave through the wounds, or would the unanswered echoes of what might have been linger as the true price of my triumph, leaving the future as uncertain as the next season's rains?